Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'll be looking at Eric Hovind's Night at the Ark Encounter movie. There's enough actual creationist claims there that I can justify making this, but also there are some just absolutely ridiculous moments that we can use to just laugh a bit at the guy whose name is an anagram of Rhino. And really, I should pay more attention to Eric. He's supposed to be my arch nemesis after all. He just doesn't really put out a lot of material that lends itself to response videos. Also, just a bit of housekeeping. I'd like to apologize to those of you listening on the podcast. There will be quite a few more references to visuals in this one than normal. I do describe most of them in enough detail that you won't be lost, but this might be one that you do want to check out the video for if it piques your interest at all. And for the rest of you, did you guys know that I do my videos as a podcast so that you can listen to them without having to pay YouTube to let you keep a video playing while your screen is off? Well, I do. Links in the description for that if that's something that interests you. Today's video is brought to you by my own podcast, I guess. And of course, let's not forget that in order to accept this movie's premise, that an unbelieving security guard comes to Jesus through his experience with the exhibits in the Ark, we have to ignore the fact that Answers in Genesis refuses to hire anyone for anything without them signing on to their statement of faith, which insists that you believe in their flavor of Christianity, complete with explicitly holding the same bigoted views that they hold. So this unbelieving security guard would have been fired as soon as he expressed any incredulity at any of their stories. So let's go!
Can I call you Gigantor?
Sure, dum-dum.
Oh, got me.
Okay, I know I'm not a movie review show, so I'm going to keep this kind of thing to a minimum, but that is the level of humor that we get in this movie. Who is that even aimed at? Was Dum Dum actually supposed to be a zinger? Or is the joke just that it's such a weak-ass insult? At any rate, this is the quality of acting that we get all throughout this movie.
Yeah, this place is amazing.
It is, you know, it goes up 3 stories from here.
Wow.
Apparently 3-story buildings are impressive. Have these people never seen a skyscraper? You know, the kind of building that is significantly taller than the Tower of Babel was going to be? You know, that tower which ultimately had God come down to confuse our languages because he couldn't have us building towers that could actually reach high enough to get into heaven? Yeah.
You really think a guy that was like 900 years old built this whole thing by himself?
No. And no.
Oh, so you don't believe it either?
And there you go. Security guard fired for breach of contract. End of movie. Roll credits.
I didn't say that.
What?
Well, he didn't build it by himself. He had family members that could have helped out.
Unless Tim is talking exclusively about Noah's 3 sons, and probably not even their wives because, you know, you wouldn't let the women do the woodworking back then, that's pretty mean of Noah to get his larger family to help him build an ark, only to leave them to drown when it's done. And if it is his 3 sons, 3 extra people doesn't really make that any more plausible, because as small as the Ark is compared to modern ships and buildings, it actually would have been really big back then, and there is no way that 4 guys could have built the whole thing on their own.
He could have hired construction crews. And you know what? Think about that. That would have given him an opportunity to warn people about the coming flood.
He hired construction crews. From a workforce that is described by the story that you guys want me to take literally as having been so wicked that every intention of the thoughts of their hearts were only evil continually. How does one build the ark that's going to be humanity's salvation, but evilly? Also, I'm not sure where you're getting from that story that Noah tried to warn the others. Wouldn't that go against God's wishes, since God had already decided to flood the earth when he told Noah about the coming flood and the need to build an ark? That would give these wicked people that God wants dead time to prepare and potentially survive. It seems to me that the best option for Noah preaching would be for repentance, but there was no chance of anyone repenting and turning aside God's wrath. So, at best, if he's preaching repentance and then somebody actually does repent, then maybe that could mean he would offer them a spot on the ark? But God wouldn't allow that because he explicitly told him to only take his wife, his kids, and their wives. Yeah, this story just doesn't add up no matter how you look at it.
And Bob wouldn't say he was 900 when he built it. He was in his 500s.
Oh, yeah. A 500-year-old man building a giant boat by hand makes a lot more sense than a 900-year-old man. Well done, Tim. Sorry, Jim. They've got Tim and Eric playing Jim and Derek. Like, put some effort in at least. That's just lazy.
This is in the Grand Canyon. These are bent rock layers. Do you see these?
Yeah.
No. Is it easy to bend rock?
No. It breaks.
It breaks.
Well, it depends on the conditions under which it is bent. Now, I've mentioned this experiment several times in the past, but I've never actually done it myself. Today, I decided to change that. So, I've said in the past that you can see what I mean here by putting crayons in the oven for a bit to soften them to the point where they are bendy. Well, when I actually did that, I found that it doesn't work. The oven just heats them too quickly, so by the time the middle of the crayon is warmed to a point of being bendy but not breaky, the outer portions of the crayon have already melted away. And not only does that not work for this experiment, but that's also not really analogous to the conditions that would lead to bent rocks in the first place, or to be more sciencey, rocks that have undergone ductile or plastic deformation. In an ideal situation for this type of deformation, the rock would be under very high pressure, buried a couple of kilometers below the surface at least, and would be subjected to temperatures that are hot enough to make them, well, more ductile, but not hot enough for them to fully melt. This then allows them to bend without fracturing. But that's an ideal situation, and even in that situation, the rock would likely at least end up partially metamorphosed, and there is a lot of bent rock that just is not. So what's going on there? Well, not all rocks are created equal. Some rocks are just naturally more ductile than others, and yes, even a cold rock can be bent, at least a little bit, without fracturing. Mudstones and evaporites tend to be more ductile than limestones, for instance. But then, even here, depending on what cementing agent is binding the rock grains together, there can still be differences. Silica, for example, is more brittle than calcite, and as a result, rocks cemented with silica require higher temperatures to undergo ductile deformation than those cemented with calcite. So, depending on the composition of the rock and its individual history, it can bend without fracturing in different conditions. But again, to bring it back to the idea that they should be partially metamorphosed if they have been subject to the necessary environment to accomplish that, well, when we take a closer look at these rocks, nearly 100% of the time, there is evidence that they have undergone fracturing. In fact, there are some rocks that accommodate strain and bend through a slow recrystallization process that involves thousands upon thousands of microfractures that are only visible in a sample under a microscope. So even if you find a bend that looks 100% intact, a closer examination will probably reveal that it has fractured thousands of times, and then reconstituted itself to fill in these fractures over time. Such a process would be impossible in the young Earth creation model, because the Earth simply hasn't existed for long enough to accommodate it. But the best part, in my opinion, of all of this is the fact that this is the picture that you find of bent rock layers on the Answers in Genesis article on them, written by their pet geologist, Dr. Snelling. Aside from it just being a grainy and low-quality photo that would make it impossible to draw any scientific conclusions from in the first place, there are several fractures that are visible in several of the bent layers. But even better than that is that if you find a picture of this formation without the people in it, you'll notice that the people that are present in this picture all just happen to be standing right in front of very prominent fractures that would be easily visible even in this grainy, low-quality Answers in Genesis picture. Now, I have a really hard time believing that the placement of these people was entirely accidental, so this just goes to show that, at least at Answers in Genesis, they aren't above using misleading tactics as long as they think they'll suit their purposes. But to bring this back around to the crayon experiment, this would be easier to do if I had a sous vide set up to maintain a constant temperature, but I left them in a pot of water that was kept roughly between 40 and 50 degrees Celsius, which from a bit of Googling I learned that specifically for Crayola crayons, they begin to melt at 40 and have a melting point of 50, so here's the result I got for that. As you can see, a cold crayon barely bends at all and snaps in two pretty quickly. But the one that's been sitting in the bathtub for a few hours at almost but not quite the melting point can easily be bent pretty much right back on itself. After allowing it to cool, it is once again a hard crayon, but this time bent nearly in half.
So how can you explain this over billions of years? If each of these were laid down slowly and gradually over long periods of time and they're hardened, and then this upwarp occurs, what would happen to all those rocks?
Well, it depends entirely on the conditions under which they experience this upward force. My question is, why do all of them display evidence of brittle fracturing at the highest stress points in the folds if they weren't completely lithified when they went through the bending process? Because if it's not been lithified yet, it cannot go through brittle fracturing. It would only be ductile deformation.
Right. They would break, and you don't see that. So how can we explain that?
Well, we explain that by actually looking at the rocks. They are fractured 100% of the time. Even if they don't look fractured, they likely have undergone microfracturing due to the recrystallization process that I mentioned earlier.
Well, the worldwide flood would lay down all these layers very rapidly, and while they're still soft, you get this upwarp that bends all of these, and they're not broken.
Yeah, if that were how it happened, the type of fracturing that we see would actually have been impossible. You don't get clean fracture lines through sediment that hasn't been lithified, especially not the same fracture through multiple layers. You would just get another smaller fold, probably with contamination between the layers as the grains of sediment get mixed up between them, at least a little bit. That's another thing that we don't see at all.
This is evidence of a massive flood.
Okay, looks like he's showing the same formation as the one in the picture in the AiG article on bent rocks, and while they still have strategically placed people covering up the most obvious fracture, they don't have the other people covering up all the fractures on the left, and boy, are there a lot of fractures there. Like, seriously, there are a lot of fractures visible in this picture. Here's a screenshot of that image where I highlighted just a few of the fractures that were super obvious in just a moment or two of looking for them. And interestingly enough, when I saw this second picture, I decided to go looking for it on AiG's website. So I went through some of their other articles on bent or warped rocks, and I could not find a single article that used this higher quality picture instead of the low quality one in the Snelling article. It's almost like you don't want random people on the internet to be able to go crack hunting in your rock pictures, but you trust that the people that have actually gone to the Ark and paid admission are already secure enough in the creationist fold, pun intended, to just overlook these glaring cracks in the picture that are the perfect showcase of the glaring cracks in the argument. And I left that part in, just because it's fun to watch Eric Hovind have a heavy object fall on his face, even if it was obviously just a guy off camera giving him a gentle boop with it.
At the beginning of the flood, the fountains of the Great Deep broke open, ripping apart the original continent. The water levels rose globally. Tsunamis battered the land, ripping apart the land, dragging it into the sea.
Wait, you guys think the continents were just floating on water and could just go sailing around at sea? That has to be a botched line that they just didn't bother reshooting. There is no way that they actually think that. Because then, the flood wouldn't have actually flooded the land. The land would have just floated higher as the water levels rose, right? Am I going crazy here? Like, is that what he just said? Did they mean to say that? I don't know.
During that initial 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rain, creatures from all around the globe were being drowned in the flood waters. Waters covered the mountains to a depth of 15 cubits, about 22 feet.
A depth that would require an amount of water that does not exist on the Earth, even if the highest mountain on the Earth at that point was Mount Ararat rather than Everest. I'm not going to do the calculations on that one again. I'll just leave a card to a video where I went over that in more detail.
Huge chunks of that land that had been ripped apart are now colliding underwater, creating some of our mountain ranges.
Yeah, in a process that would have released enough energy to turn the entire Earth into a big molten ball that would take millions of years to cool off. And that's not even according to mainstream geologists, that's according to the young Earth creationist geophysicist John Baumgartner, who concluded his paper on the topic by essentially saying, yeah, you know what, we need to just stop worrying about making the science fit where it doesn't and just come to the grips with using magic as the explanation. Now, obviously, he didn't say it in quite those words, but that is essentially the point he was making. When your own scientists conclude that it's impossible without making fundamental changes to the laws of physics, then maybe don't try and present your ideas as though they are supported by science.
We've done all the calculations. We figured out how much water they need, how much food they need.
And so you figured out that it was way too much?
But there's millions of species.
There are millions of species on Earth today. But let's think through this a little bit, okay? Whales, dolphins, fish, where do they live? Where do they live?
in the water.
That's right. During a flood, do you think they have to be on board the Ark?
Yes, absolutely. Because, assuming it's raining freshwater and not saltwater, the change in the salinity of the ocean would kill all the marine creatures, and there probably was enough salt in the oceans that the increase in salinity when it got mixed with the fresh water from the lakes and rivers and stuff would have killed most of the freshwater aquatic life. There are some species that can adapt to brackish water that may have been able to survive, but it takes special adaptations to live in salt water, and those adaptations would kill the organism if it suddenly was inundated with fresh water. Just ask anyone who has ever kept a saltwater fish tank how important it is to get the salinity of the water just right to keep the fish alive. Now, I suppose you could say that God miraculously kept those organisms alive during the flood, but if he was going to provide miracle protection to all of the aquatic life, why could he not do the same for the terrestrial life rather than wipe it all out? Also, Genesis does say that Noah took all the animals on the ark which had the breath of life in them. That would include all the marine mammals like whales, dolphins, manatees, etc. Now, I've read the Answers in Genesis explanation for this. It basically requires the same extremely rapid evolution that paring down the number of animals on the ark to a few thousand would require. Basically, the created kinds were created with the ability to tolerate fresh and salty water, and so that's how they survived the flood. So again, they appeal to a greater degree of evolution happening right after Noah's flood than anyone who accepts evolution would even claim is possible in the first place. And they do this in an attempt to provide evidence for a story that they use to claim that evolution isn't real. It is very much a have your cake and eat it too scenario.
Got me there. All right.
There are millions of species of insects. Do they have to be on board the Ark?
Well, even if they were, I mean, it's a big place. They wouldn't take up a whole lot of room.
Yeah, but they're not required on board the Ark because they can survive a flood and they don't fit the description given in the Bible of the creatures that need to be on board the Ark.
Quite the contrary, I think most insects would not be able to survive a year-long flood. Like, one of the easiest ways to kill an insect is to drown it, to flood it with water. They struggle to escape. The flying ones can't even get their wings going enough to get airborne, and they either drown or starve to death. They also do fit the description of the animals required on the Ark. They have the breath of life, even if they don't breathe in the same way as the animals with lungs, and they are creeping things. Now, sure, the ones that fly, you could get off on the technicality that they are not creeping things of the ground, but again, the flying ones are the ones that are the easiest to kill with water. And yeah, there might be space on board the Ark for the insects, but I imagine the ones that primarily eat wood would be a bit of a problem.
How about microorganisms and bacteria, those things?
They certainly wouldn't take up a lot of room.
No, maybe they could all fit inside of a thimble, but they're always included in the list of the millions of species.
So how many animals would have been on the Ark?
They only needed a total of 1,400 kinds, fewer than 7,000 animals total.
Nope, not even the creationist kinds logic can get you to a number that small, not even if we're being generous. I'm not going to run the numbers again, I did that in a previous video that, again, I'll link to and leave a card, but it winds up with us having about, again, if we're being super generous here, 300,000 individual animals on the Ark. But even if we go with the 7,000 number that they're claiming here, which is down from the 14,000 number that they used to claim, which I point out only because creationist organizations, including Answers in Genesis, will often criticize scientists for constantly updating the science based on new information. But even if we stick with the 7,000 animals that they're saying here, they supposedly had 8 people on the Ark caring for these 7,000 animals for an entire year. The Ark Encounter has at least 7 zookeepers on their staff to care for around 200 animals, but if the flood story is true, it should be a piece of cake for only one person to care for that tiny number of animals, would it not? Oh, yeah, I should also mention that the 300,000 number only considers currently extant animals, but AiG wants the extinct ones to be represented as well, so yeah, it just doesn't work no matter how you slice it.
So this is a sauropod dinosaur.
Oh, the big ones.
Yeah, they were huge, except when they weren't.
Oh.
When they were young. They were a lot smaller.
Got 'em on the Ark.
Of course. You know, it makes a lot of sense to bring the younger ones. They eat less, they have less weight, they have many more years to reproduce.
Even if all that is true, which anyone who's raised a child in the middle of a growth spurt can tell you is not necessarily true, this still acknowledges the waste problem that we have. Answers in Genesis is fond of saying that the average size of the animal on the Ark was about the size of a sheep. Well, the average sheep poops about 1.8 kilograms or 4 pounds per day. That's 12.7 metric tons, or 14 American tons, for 7,000 animals. meaning that with 8 people on the Ark, they had to shovel 1.5 metric or 1.75 American tons of poop every day.
That is one big pile of shit.
Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to stick with the American units because those are the units that I'm finding the most easily for these measurements. But to put that in perspective, a 5-gallon pail can carry about 0.67 cubic feet of manure, which weighs about 16.7 pounds. So to move 1.75 tons of manure, that's 3,500 pounds, would require 210 trips with a 5-gallon pail. Assuming an average of 10 minutes for a trip with 2 buckets of manure per trip to dump it overboard, which is generous considering how big the Ark is and how high up they would have to climb in order to dump it, that means that every person on the Ark would have to spend 17.5 hours out of every day doing nothing but carrying buckets of manure. And that doesn't even factor in the time that it would take to actually scoop the poop into the bucket. At this point, everybody only has 6.5 hours left in their day, and assuming an average of 2 animals per enclosure for a total of 3,500 enclosures, they now have about 6.6 seconds per enclosure to feed all the animals, which would have to include going to get whatever specific food that animal requires, walking to the enclosure, and doing the actual feeding. There is literally not enough time in the day for these 8 people to have cared for 7,000 animals, much less the more than 300,000 that would actually have been represented given how creationists typically define kind, when they actually do define it, which is not very often.
Have a look at this. What do you think caused all of this?
Looks like water to me.
That's right, it's all erosional features. Do you know where this is found?
No.
Is Eric supposed to be playing an illiterate character in this? It literally says Mars in huge letters right at the top of that poster.
Right here, on Mars.
Mars.
A planet with no known liquid water on the surface. Yet we see those erosion features, so it does look like there was some flooding there in the past, and many scientists think it was a huge flood there.
Huge as in containing about the same amount of water as the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah.
Now we have all of those erosional features in much greater abundance and much larger scale right here on this planet. Our home.
Earth.
That's right.
Well, how about that? The bigger planet that has always had more water has more abundant and larger erosional features than the one that is smaller and has always had less water. Color me shocked.
And do you think that maybe this has some water that could cause flooding?
How much of the Earth is covered by water?
70%.
Okay, but again, in one of the videos that I've already linked to, it turns out that in order to completely flood the Earth, you need about 7 times the current amount of water that's available at the surface. That's oceans, lakes, ice, water vapor, everything, in order to actually do this flooding. Just because there's a lot of water there doesn't mean that it's enough to cover the entire thing.
So why are so many unwilling to accept a major flood, a global flood here on Earth, but they're willing to accept one here on Mars? You know why?
Because the evidence points to a lot more water having been on Mars in the past, but to Earth's water levels having remained relatively stable over the years? I wonder if they address how Mars lost its water, because that's something that definitely doesn't fit in with a young universe. Okay, I was gonna play a bit more and then say no, but they literally just say it shows their bias and then move on past this part as if they've made their point. Okay, so what did happen to all the water on Mars? I'll tell you. The prevailing hypothesis for years has been that the low gravity of Mars has allowed water vapor in the atmosphere to just be blown away by the solar wind, and over billions of years that's had quite the impact. Now, that certainly has happened to an extent, but more recent evidence suggests that because Mars is less geologically active than the Earth, the water was slowly absorbed into the various rocks and minerals as they were forming. Many times of rocks contain water in various forms, or at least the molecules that when released will make up water. Earth's geology constantly recycles this water, bringing it back up to the surface periodically. Mars doesn't, so as the water on the surface interacted with the various minerals, it just got absorbed. It's hard to calculate how much was absorbed as opposed to being lost to space, but either process would require billions of years in order to happen. So the fact that Mars was once flooded, rather than providing evidence that the Earth could have been flooded, instead provides excellent evidence that at least the solar system is a few billion years old.
So, all the people on Earth died?
They all died.
Why would God do this?
Derek, it's called judgment.
Yep, judgment. You know what? If you find yourself making excuses for genocide as a part of your worldview, you should probably re-examine your worldview. I mean, yeah, I guess that's kind of an argument from consequences. God committing genocide might make God an immoral monster, but it doesn't automatically mean that he doesn't exist, right? But creationists use the argument from consequences all the time against evolution, so turnabout's fair play. Yeah, a belief in evolution did lead to the harmful adoption of social Darwinism in some cases, mostly in the early 1900s, and that was bad. But that being bad doesn't mean that evolution itself didn't happen. But also, there's nothing about the theory of evolution that says that humans have to be morally good all the time, so the fact that bad things have sometimes resulted from an acceptance of it doesn't actually do anything to prove it wrong. Whereas, if the Bible is true, then God is supposed to not just be all-loving, but is himself supposed to be love incarnate. Now, I don't know about you, but I would never even consider genocide to be an option to use against people that I hate, much less people that I'm supposed to love. God's actions are not consistent with what God is supposed to be. So in this case, an argument from consequences works, because it shows God to be inconsistent with what his character is supposed to be.
Listen to a few verses from Genesis 6. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
Yeah, and then according to you, Noah hired these evil people to build the bloody ark in the first place. Now, I'm skipping the rest of this section, but I did want you guys to see their little diorama of evil, because it's just delightful. Like, it's a party where women in the equivalent of bikinis just happen to be dancing, and there is food and alcohol. Now, remember when Jesus turned water into wine in order to keep the party going longer? This diorama is probably about that same level of party, maybe without the bikini girls. But I also wonder how many hardcore conservative Christian homeschool parents got to that display and then had to suddenly rush to cover their kids' eyes in shock that such lechery would be on display in a Christian establishment. I'll bet there are some sheltered kids that have this display in their spank banks for sure. And it's in the segment that I'm skipping, so just to satisfy everybody, here is the best display that AIG has in any of their museums. It's the arena of people fighting a dinosaur, with the dinosaur even coming complete with a cute little hat.
So, I mean, the world was really bad. Wait a minute. The world today's pretty bad. Doesn't this world deserve to be judged again?
Given the story that we're in the middle of hearing, that is Eric saying that he thinks that everybody deserves to be executed right now. Everyone. Guys, gals, non-binary pals, and babies. But I'll bet that Eric calls himself pro-life when we're not talking about the flood. And slightly off topic, but I find it amusing that if you watch the discussion that he had with Paulogia not long ago, which is an opportunity I doubt that I'll have after this video, but anyway, at one point he tries to poke holes in secular humanism by making up this hypothetical where it's agreed that it would make life objectively better for everybody if we just Thanos'd half the population away. Clearly that's immoral, but that's something that is potentially okay in secular humanism.
And if we ran the numbers and said, listen, by eliminating, let's just say 4 billion people right now, which is a lot of people, by eliminating 4 billion people now, we'll eliminate them in a way that doesn't hurt them at all. We can cease them to exist, or, it's all just put to sleep. That way there's no pain. It's just, wow, you're just put to sleep. And I ran the numbers and said, but then over the next 1,000 years, we're going to have 300 billion individuals living in a society that is way better off. Their individual flourishing is going to skyrocket. And if we don't do that, then we're not only going to have these 4 billion, we're going to have, 100 billion more that are actually not doing as good individually. And we literally run the numbers. So I am thinking both individual and as humanity as a whole.
Well, here in this video is Eric saying that it was a good thing when God did that, but with 99.9% of all life, not just half of all humans. And usually this is justified by creationists using the same logic that would get our hypothetical humanists to say that killing half the population would be good. God knows the consequences of his actions, and even though genocide is not desirable, long term he knows that it will bring about a greater good. Man, that sentence just felt gross to say. So, anyway, now it becomes a question about what morality even is. It's supposed to be God's nature, not utilitarian calculations. And yet, any time a biblical genocide is justified by an apologist, they almost always appeal to a utilitarian calculation of one sort or another, which is the exact kind of calculation that they despise when other people do it. Even if we grant that God is omniscient, so he always runs the numbers absolutely perfectly, that's still landing on utilitarian ethics, which means that God is not required for morality, he's just better at running the calculations than we are. So that kind of takes the wind out of the whole moral argument for God.
You know, my mom believed all this.
That's right, she did. She went through the narrow door that leads to eternal life.
Yo, you know, my wife didn't believe all this. Where did she go, Tim? You know, as much as the people that are willing to tell you your loved ones are burning in hell at their funeral are assholes, at least they're honest assholes. This is a movie where Eric is supposed to be playing a character. Just once in one of these movies, I would like to see them give the main character a dead relative that is unquestionably in hell in their worldview, and then try to explain how you are supposed to be happy in heaven while knowing that people you care about are being tortured by the person that you're supposed to be worshipping while in heaven.
Well, it sounds like they got a lot of science to back up their claims. So you think the vast majority of scientists are just lying to us? But don't you remember? It's all about the starting. If you start with evolution, you believe the science backs up evolution. And if you start with creation, then the science will confirm the Bible.
That was basically a full-blown admission that you don't even try to avoid confirmation bias. The thing is, the science, or more appropriately the current scientific body of knowledge and understanding, does not leave enough interpretational wiggle room to shrink a 13.7 billion-year-old universe down into just 6,000 years. And there are several completely independent fields of study that confirm that fact, even as we saw in this video. The amount of time it would take for the water to leave Mars, or rather be absorbed by it, doesn't fit with a 6,000-year-old universe. And that's not even an event on Earth. Sure, you could say that God magicked some of the elements for the flood if you really want to, but what reason could he possibly have for flooding Mars and then just magically completely drying it up in a manner that appears so slow as to require billions of years of time? Was Mars maybe where he started humanity 1.0 and they didn't get a Noah when they screwed up, so they just all died with Adam and Eve being humanity 2.0? What possible reason could he have for making Mars look way older than it is, just from the perspective of how long it took the water to disappear? And that is just one data point. There's also the size of the observable universe, with photons having to have been in transit for billions of years in order to reach us. There's geologic processes on Earth, there's radiometric dating, and even at this point there is so much evidence for evolution that evolution itself is evidence that the Earth has been around for a long time in order for evolution to have happened. Though certainly I wouldn't want to use that as the primary line of evidence for the age of the Earth. And this barely even scratches the surface. Creationists have to ignore all of this, or to try to explain it away with post hoc rationalizations. Never has creationism been successfully used to make any scientific prediction, whereas conventional science has made and confirmed all kinds of predictions, from the cosmic microwave background radiation to figuring out how far down you have to drill in a glacier to find ice with certain specific characteristics, to figuring out where on the Earth and in which rock layers you would find an animal like Tiktaalik, and more.
You know, that sounds really philosophical and all, but I'm sticking with evolution. Are you kidding? What good has that done for us?
And there's the argument from consequences. Evolution doesn't need to have done you any good in order for it to actually be true. In fact, I wish we were specially created instead of evolved. Then I would have less back and knee pain. I wouldn't need glasses. I wouldn't need to spend all day walking on a treadmill while I'm working in order to avoid the increased risk of things like blood clots and heart disease that come from sitting all day. Maybe we could have been designed to need less sleep so that we can actually enjoy more time being conscious. Hell, I'd be happy if we were just designed without the need for sleep in the first place. It seems like such a waste to just have to lie there, not doing anything for several hours out of every day. I could just get so much more done if I didn't need to go to sleep. So, yeah, seems like being specially created would have been a hell of a lot better for us than evolution. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that we did in fact evolve, and so we all have to deal with these issues that mostly exist because evolution isn't so much survival of the fittest, rather it's survival of the good enough. It just needed to make the organisms that are good enough to pass on their genes to the next generation. After they've reproduced, doesn't matter what happens. Humans are actually fairly lucky to be a social species because it can be helpful to have grandparents that help care for children, because that at least puts a bit of selection pressure on us to live longer, but there are diminishing returns, so aging ends up being a painful process. And that's it for this one. There is an after-credit scene that I could address, but it just goes in a completely different direction, talking about how he doesn't consider humans to be apes, and that he doesn't think that Lucy represents one of our evolutionary ancestors. I already have plenty of material on that on my channel, so it's not really necessary to essentially just start another video over at this point, but I might cover it in the future if I remember that it even exists. Today's comment of the day comes to us from John73John, who says, "I just want to let you know that I'm not the John who wrote that book. That should help narrow it down." Thank you, John. Every little bit helps. So that's 1 down, 3,720 to go. Yes, I know that number is small, but I have no idea how many Johns have existed in the last 2,000 years, and as long as I'm just pulling numbers out of my butt, I thought I'd go for the Star Wars reference.
Sir, the possibility of successfully navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1.
Never tell me the odds.
Thanks for watching, thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Jonathan Roberts, Meg Mitchell, and all the rest, who are the 5-gallon buckets that are filled with the manure that is my channel. If you'd like to carry shit for 17.5 hours every day, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!